Welcome to Duo Dive. I'm Allie.
I'm Ashley.
And this is the podcast for curious people. Each week, we'll dive into a new topic and explore stories you may or may not have heard of, but you definitely won't forget. Hello, Ashley. How are you today?
What's up, girl? You always kill that intro. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. I try and, keep my voice all nice and smooth.
We can always count on Allie to kill it.
Well, I want to go ahead and point out one thing to you. I am in a new office space. As I'm sure you can see, there is no printer on a side table behind me from my living room.
Moving up in the world.
Thank you. I have been working from home for over 2 years, and I finally just got an actual room cleared out of furniture so I could put office furniture in it. So I'm very excited.
Living your best life. I actually did get to see this in person as well. Very exciting. And for all of our listeners who want to check out Allie's background, we are now on YouTube, so you can see our videos of us talking. Because what's better than listening to us, looking at us? Duh.
Yeah, so go subscribe, rate, whatever, YouTube allows you to do. Also make sure that you are subscribing and rating on any podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, etc. That's probably how we're going to get boosted up.
Yeah, that's so all of our effort is not for nothing, We appreciate all of our listeners too. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. Well, Ash, it is your week. How are you feeling? What are we talking about?
Girl, okay, I'm pretty excited. So I saw this bombshell headline a week or two ago that said thousands of migrant workers had died during the construction of the World Cup in Qatar. So I was like, I really got to dig into this and let the people know what's going on, including myself. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all of the controversy, but mostly honing in on the migrant workers who have been exploited during this 2022 World Cup.
Well, this should be interesting. We were just together this past weekend, and we did go watch the U.S. versus England game. So I know very little about soccer, but I'm kind of invested in the World Cup right now, so I'm excited.
Yes, I think many of us are, and that was a very exciting game to watch, even though there was no score. So as someone who has also been invested in the World Cup, this has been very interesting to explore. So without further ado, let's dive in. Woo! All right. As the FIFA World Cup has begun in Qatar, the country is facing media scrutiny for the abuse and exploitation of migrant workers and discrimination against women and LGBT people. So have you heard the uproar or anything about this?
Okay, so a bit. The only thing I've really paid attention to, because I did want to be kind of naive when we went into this episode.
Yeah.
I do know that Qatar as a country is very strict in their religious values and morals. And I do know that they are kind of under the basis of, if you're going to visit our country, you're going to follow our rules. Right. Then you have the other side saying where your rules are not what the rest of the world is following. You're kind of behind in these basic human needs and allowances that everyone is providing. So we don't want to follow your rules.
Right. Exactly.
I didn't say that very eloquently, but yeah.
No, I know exactly what you mean though. And I think that's a pretty good summary of what's happening. So to get a little deeper, first, this is one everyone pretty much knows about. They said they were going to serve beer at the World Cup, and now they are not. The only people that can buy beer are the people that are in boxes. So it's kind of going along with the theme in the country, very common theme that a lot of people know about, which is if you're rich, you can get away with anything and screw everyone else.
Well, why would they say they were selling beer? Did they just want the advertisement or the endorsement from companies?
So they said they were going to allow a lot of things. So FIFA, which is the people that are over the World Cup, is kind of equivalent to NFL.
Okay.
FIFA is. So FIFA would award them the ability to host the World Cup. They said that we'll serve beer. Another thing they said is we will allow the support of LGBTQ activism and rights. And now people had made these armbands that were rainbow colored and aren't even allowed to wear them into the stadiums.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So those are like two of the big news stories that everyone is hearing about. So Qatari authorities have been quick to deflect attention from the country's human rights record by claiming the criticism is racist, especially when it comes to this stuff about the migrant workers. The FIFA president, Gianni Infantino, said the same, and he delivered an hour-long rambling speech on the eve of the World Cup where he stated he knew what it feels like to be discriminated against because he was bullied as a child for having red hair and freckles. I thought that was a little cringy. He went on to say, and quote, "Today I feel Arab. Today I feel African. Today I feel gay. And today I feel like a migrant worker." He also went after European leaders for criticizing the event due to their tarnished past from things like colonialism. So basically he's saying, you guys, like, what about you guys? Y'all used to be colonialists, deflecting.
I couldn't even really like follow what the point of it was.
Yeah, it was an hour-long rambling speech, basically just deflecting, and everyone was just like, dude, you missed the mark, but okay. So it's important to note, though, the inequalities that are present today in Qatar. This is a country where you can literally face jail time for being gay. Even women have been jailed for having premarital sex, even though they were raped.
Where's Qatar located?
So Qatar is actually really small. It's the size of Connecticut, but it's bordering like the United Arab Emirates and then also Saudi Arabia. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia are like right next to it.
Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, those are pretty wealthy countries, right?
Yes. Qatar also, they have like mad oil money, essentially.
Okay.
So we'll dive into that a little bit more when we're talking about why these migrant workers are dealing with what they're dealing with. And that is the main thing I want to focus on is the severe inequalities and mistreatment that the migrant workers have faced in the last 12 years. So it's important to note that Qatar was awarded the ability to host the World Cup in 2010.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that it was decided so far in advance. So it's kind of like the Olympics.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And it's important to note that these migrant workers have played like a huge role in making this possible because they have been the majority builders of the $220 billion infrastructure for the World Cup. Like you said, it's like the Olympics. They're building hotels, etc. Like it's not just sports stadiums.
Gotcha. So they're essentially building a little city for any type of tourism that might come in.
Exactly. So, and one of the reason there are so many migrant workers is that only 10% of residents in Qatar are actually citizens who are born in Qatar. Everyone else there is from somewhere else.
That's so interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of another country being that way.
Yeah. So I think this is really common in these Middle Eastern oil countries, from what I'm understanding. Yeah. Unfortunately, many third parties, such as the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have been sounding the alarm on the mistreatment of these workers. And a recent report by The Guardian said more than 6,500 migrant workers from the countries of India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have died in Qatar since it won the right to host the World Cup 10 years ago. That's just the ones that they have accounted for. Mm-hmm. A lot of these migrant workers are coming from those countries, those South Asian countries, but there are other countries that aren't even represented in that number, like Kenya, who sends a lot of migrant workers to Qatar. While these death records are not categorized by like occupation or place of work, it's likely that many of the workers who have died were employed in this World Cup infrastructure project because a significant proportion of the migrant workers who have died since 2011 were only there because they were helping Qatar get ready to host the World Cup. It's really important to note, like when FIFA awarded Qatar the 2022 World Cup in 2010, they didn't insist on any labor right conditions, even though they knew that it would take almost millions of people to build the necessary infrastructure. And they also knew that they had this system, which is called the kafala system, that really a lot of people equate to modern day slavery. So FIFA just kind of turned a blind eye and was like, y'all figure it out. We don't really care.
Do they have a history of like turning a blind eye to labor conditions, or like going into a country and saying you have to do something XYZ, or is this kind of standard?
This is standard for FIFA. So FIFA, like some other sports organizations that we've discussed,
actually is out for the sports.
I hate them. They have a very bad history. So let me give a little background on that, actually. FIFA itself was like put together in the early 1900s. I think it was like 1904. But in the 70s is when they became a little bit, I would say, corrupt and scrutinized. And that's when they started taking in these like large sums of money from sponsors, like Adidas being, yeah, exactly.
For anybody listening, I was just making money signs.
Yeah. Spend that money, honey. And even there have been accusations that Qatar bribed FIFA to have.
Yes. Yeah, I did hear that.
Yeah. So this brings me to another like really important thing that I've learned about with this, and it's a term called sports washing. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so this is like a tactic that countries with maybe kind of a questionable history use to host like a major sporting event to try to rid themselves of their past reputation, essentially rewriting the way that people are thinking about them. So great example, Nazi Germany hosting the Olympics.
Yeah. Okay.
Or Russia even hosting the World Cup.
Okay, so in the timeline of like your example of like say the Nazis hosting the Olympics, I can kind of understand that for that time period. I don't understand it for this current time period because like everything is on social media. Like,
yeah,
do they not know what cancel culture is? Like, you give Qatar the World Cup and people are literally going to find everything wrong and then share it with millions of people because now we have access to share things with millions of people. Yeah, and then you have people like Ashley pointing at herself who will talk about it. And so I just don't understand why in this day and age a country that is kind of so corrupt and treats its people so wrong would be interesting in being on this global platform.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. But they're probably seeing even countries like China who hosted the Olympics, what was it, this past year? And they're getting good positive press. So I think Qatar thought we could do the same thing. And that's why you have them deflecting and saying, well, what about you guys? You guys did all this, shady stuff. But I think you're right. I think people are, I think they're being held more accountable now because of social media, which is great.
Yeah. One of the good things about social media, we can learn very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, it's important to note too, FIFA itself has like not cared about the country and what they're doing to their people. I mentioned the 70s when, it really became about money. At that point in time, they hosted the World Cup in Argentina, and there was a huge dictatorship there that was like horrible to its citizens, and people were really, really disappointed then as well. But they just continue to do it because they don't really face any ramifications. So
solid.
Love it. Okay, so I mentioned the kafala system, which a lot of people equate to modern day slavery. Mm-hmm. It's important to note that when FIFA selected Qatar for the World Cup in 2010, they were still openly using the kafala system, which, like, in less grandiose terms, it's a work sponsorship system. So they claim to have abolished the system by now, Qatar does, but many critics are saying, like, the reforms are poorly enforced and it's a little too late because they abolished the kafala system or parts of the system 2 years ago. So people have been working under this for the past 10 years.
Not recent enough, basically.
Exactly. Okay. I want to explain to you exactly how this impacts a migrant worker, the system. But first, I want to provide context to the history of the kafala system because it is important to note that it was a British creation in the early 20th century.
Okay.
So this is where things get complicated, right? It's not all Qatar people are evil. The British people actually created this. Like we can recognize that today. I don't think a lot of people really talk about that, but the system basically enabled British officials to bring in and control large numbers of colonial subjects from South Asia and other countries during the early 20th century when they were doing a lot of oil exploration. But following the independence from British rule, the Gulf rulers kept and reinforced the kafala system. So all migrant workers coming to their countries would need a kafil, which is a sponsor, to take responsibility of their legal status, including whether they could leave or enter the country or change employers. So basically, you get a kafil, they control whether you can even leave the country.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a few problems with this, and I want you and the listeners to pretend that you are being put in this situation. So imagine that you're a poor male, right? You have kids and a family. You live in Southeast Asia. You've been looking for a job to provide to your family for months. Like you cannot find a job, and you've just been getting by with side gigs, making maybe even $1 a day. Then a recruitment agency personnel comes to you and they come to your town and they promise you what's equivalent to like $300, $400 a month to come to Qatar as a construction worker. And right now you're only making maybe $60 or $70 a month. So that's like a substantial increase, right? Mm-hmm. You would do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would too. So you agree and you go to Qatar planning to send money back to your family. And after you sign a contract, which is in a language that you don't even understand, you arrive in Qatar on a visa, and that visa is linked to the construction company that you're working for. So when you arrive, you're put in a camp with other people in squalid conditions from your country. And you begin the work, which is extremely grueling. Important to note, Qatar is a desert. You have to work in extreme heat, often without water breaks. You begin to wonder if you made the right decision, as you're often threatened to have pay withheld if you're seen taking too many water breaks. And on multiple occasions, you see colleagues pass out from the heat, never to return again. Then after a month passes, you get your paycheck and it's significantly less than what you were promised. This is because you're actually in debt to the recruitment agency who hired you and secured your visa. And you find out you owe what's equivalent to over $3,000 to this agency, which means that despite the gruesome working conditions, you're unable to leave because of the debt that you owe. And if you were to pick up and leave without telling your company, you're not allowed to exit the country because you need your sponsor's permission to do so. And if you were to get fired, your visa would be null and void, and you can be imprisoned or deported for being in the country illegally.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm also just thinking, like, if you're in debt and you have no money to send back to your family for months at a time until you hopefully pay off this debt. I mean, even though you're making $60, $70 and it wasn't a lot, like, it was something, and now you're being not able to send back anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And who knows, you might die, or even like there is one person I was reading about, and they've noted, a lot of people don't die from heat, but they die from conditions associated with the heat. So this guy's kidneys got really jacked up. So he returned back to his home country with like messed up kidneys, and now he has to do dialysis and needs a kidney transplant. How are you supposed to provide for your family when you're sick? Yeah. So pretty messed up.
I guess, like, as an American, we just don't realize, like, some of the basic human principles that we have. Like, you would never be hired somewhere and not be allowed to have a water break.
Yeah. Or even the idea of at-will employment. Like, I've seen that when I've signed contracts at work, and I'm like, what the hell? Like, why do we need to? I feel like this goes without saying that if I want to quit, I can quit.
Yeah.
Apparently it does not in some places, which is insane,
Absolutely. And we just definitely, like, take it for granted. I mean, there's so many things we take for granted, but
yeah, this
is definitely one of them.
Another thing too, and I was watching a video on TikTok actually of like two Black men who had a podcast. I wish I knew their name because I'll put it in the description though, for sources. But they were saying, like, we yeah, discrimination is like bad in America, but over there it's even worse. Like if you are of a different nationality than like Western or Qatari, you are automatically like a third class citizen. So if I was a Southeast Asian person and I went over there with like a medical degree, I would still be treated like I would be a minimum wage worker no matter what.
I also feel like in countries like that, they just aren't used to different skin colors the way that we are here. And of course, we definitely have our issues and everyone has something to work on. But over there, they probably just don't see as many differences as we do every day when we walk around.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's like essentially a caste system. If you've heard of that, the one that exists in India, it's like that, but for your nationality.
Yeah.
So that sucks. I do want to note, though, that, and I'm going to give Qatar some credit. I'm just going to be open and honest with what they've done, in my opinion, to save face. But since 2010, they've attempted reforms. So in 2020, 2 years ago, Qatari authorities undertook crucial reforms to the kafala system to finally allow most workers the right to leave the country without employer permission and allowing workers to change jobs as well without needing employer permission. So that's happened in the last 2 years, which is a step in the right direction. However, a recent report at the beginning of November by Amnesty International argues these reforms are not enough as the benefits have been limited due to their late introduction, narrow scope, and poor enforcement. It has also been so weakly enforced that many workers remain trapped and are still fighting for their wages. And only a small fraction of workers secured jobs without paying illegal recruitment fees.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. Like, how many people actually know about it over there? Like, they may have passed this, but enforcing it is something completely different. And when you're working under these types of conditions, like, changes are not, no one's telling you about these changes. Like, no one's having a staff meeting and telling you what's changed. You literally don't know. You probably work 12 plus hours a day, go home and try and eat and sleep and then just do it again. You probably barely see anybody other than the main managers above you. Like, there's no HR.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you do find out about these changes, what are you going to do? You don't have a lawyer.
They'll just tell you to go home and they'll find someone else.
Exactly. So that, and I read another story about that happening where I think it was like 10 to 20 of the workers realized that these changes had taken place and all of a sudden they were detained in prison. So, you know.
Makes sense.
Said, what are you going to do? Also, a 2020 survey found that the average recruitment costs for Bangladeshis going to work in Qatar was around $3,863, which is equivalent to 18 months of earnings in Qatar. So say you go there for 3 years, you spend the first 18 months paying off getting over there, not to mention the fact that you might not even realize that you're doing that because you might have signed your contract in a different language.
Well, I guess this brings it back to my earlier kind of point that I had. Do we know if they're taking the entire paycheck or are they able to send like a meager something home? Is that something we know or situational?
Situational. I think it just depends. Yeah. From my understanding. The Amnesty International report also noted that thousands of workers' deaths since 2010 remain unexplained, with hundreds of them likely to be linked to exposure to Qatar's extreme heat in many months of the year. I will also note that in 2020, Qatar created labor laws around the temperature and the time of day. I think it was between June and September. Construction workers weren't allowed to work between the hours of like 10 to 2 p.m. or something. So during like the peak. That's not exact times or months, but you get the idea. Additionally, like if it was above a certain temperature, they weren't allowed to work either. But then there were people saying that wasn't actually the case and like that was never enforced because it's kind of impossible to enforce. So
we're just getting these like, hey, here are these changes we're making, but no actual proof to back
right
that they're actually affecting people.
It's basically like they knew people were going to be saying like, hey, this kafala system's really fucked up and you're basically enslaving people. So 2 years before the actual cup, they're like, okay, let's just make all these rules and not actually enforce them. That way we can say we made them though, and no one can say anything.
Yeah, when they're down to putting like the finishing touches on things, they're like, okay, we don't actually need all this slave labor, just a few of you.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what seems like going on. Of course, Qatar, they're obviously, like we mentioned before, they're not known for their human rights, right? And I guess it doesn't really come to a surprise given that they're a Middle Eastern country. But I do think what is a surprise to many is the way that FIFA has kind of allowed this. And they're expecting billions of dollars in revenue from the 2022 World Cup, but they've failed to address and mitigate the harm caused by Qatar's systems. And initially, FIFA focused on Qatar's plans for like air-conditioned stadiums to ensure the health of visiting players and fans, many of whom were from wealthier countries. And they even switched the tournament from the summer to the winter. Usually it's in the summer, but they put it in November because of the heat. But the soccer's governing body apparently had little regard for the conditions of the millions of low-paid migrant workers who toiled in extreme temperatures of over 122 degrees Fahrenheit for years. So shout out to FIFA for not giving a fuck.
Yeah, it seems a major organization like that should be kind of top of the line when it comes to planning. I mean, it's definitely something that we don't think about as viewers, and especially American viewers. Like, we're just like, oh, giant soccer stadium, organization of a World Cup. Yeah. Awesome. And so it's definitely really interesting to hear the other side of it. Like, when you told me that they got the bid in 2010 and in 2011, like, things started to be reported, like, that's just crazy to me. That's 11 years ago. And they've been doing all of this since. Like, this whole thing that we're currently watching has been set in motion 11, 12 years ago.
Yeah, I didn't realize the scale of the World Cup. Like, you made a really great comparison of it to the Olympics, and that is accurate. It's just as big, if not bigger. So it's interesting that such a large organization is not being held to higher standards.
Do we know where these tournaments are going to be played next? Like, is there anything you think will change by the next time we come around to another World Cup?
I think that's a good question. What FIFA cares about most is money.
Okay.
So when this is all said and done, I will argue, although I could be wrong, that it will have been worth it for FIFA to have done the World Cup in Qatar, because they're making an enormous amount of money, like a record amount of money was spent even on the infrastructure, 220 billion. But not to mention the fact that they were definitely bribed. And like, that's open knowledge that FIFA was bribed by Qatari officials. And I think because countries like Qatar, there are so many that exist who are almost obsessed with their images and trying to create a better image in the world platform. They're willing to pay the big bucks. Like, whereas countries like America or Europe, we don't really care. Like, there's not really much benefit to having the World Cup. In fact, it's more of an annoyance for us. So I think actually the World Cup will continue to be hosted in these very, I guess, controversial countries.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it's just all about money and power. So
as you're doing your research, like, I know there's a couple other things that obviously have happened since the World Cup has started. Shout out to the Iranian men's team for not singing during their national anthem, and a couple other things that have made headlines. But are you seeing this narrative that we're talking about be really prominent in headlines, or did you have to do a lot of research, sort of digging into it?
No, I think a lot of people are talking about it, and that's really exciting. There are a lot of other issues that are on the forefront too, like the LGBT rights and women's rights as well. But this is a top one, and I think the fact that I saw it as a headline and then just dove deeper into it, and it was pretty easy to do so, that's a good sign. So, but it's like one of those things, like with the NFL and the concussion stuff, we know it's happening, but they're not really doing anything about it, you know? And as for me, like, I'm still watching the World Cup. I still watch football, you know, so I'm just as guilty as anyone. So I don't know. I guess we're privileged, and I don't know what the answer is.
Well, I don't think we have to have all the answers, especially as two 20-something white women in America. But I think it's important to know what is happening, keep an eye on it, educate ourselves. And then if something does come up that we can support and be involved in, like we already have the background we need to jump right in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there are organizations like I believe Amnesty International helps with this. If there's a way to help, I'm definitely interested. And I will share with you guys what I find.
Yeah, this is really crazy. Thank you for researching it and bringing it to our attention, our ears, our feed. We hope everyone enjoyed Ashley's topic this week, and we will be back next week with another thing we think you just gotta know.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.